Imagine yourself in the middle of a classic risk discussion. Someone surfaces a newly discovered failure. It might have originated from an internal audit observation, or maybe a self-assessment that the team ran before an upcoming review, or maybe it was a question that somebody decided to finally ask out loud. Why does this keep happening? The room knows there's a gap. Within 48 hours, and often in that same meeting, the room redescribes the gap. Someone dropped the ball. We need to retrain the staff. The workflow wasn't followed. And none of these statements might be false, but all of them are beside the point. That redescription, the impulse to make the gap smaller, more fixable, and more like a personnel issue rather than a structural one, is the single most reliable indicator that that gap is going to persist. And I call it the flinch. Welcome back to Into the Void. I'm Mark Vanis, founder of Void Vanguard. In the last episode, I walked through diagnose, the first stage of the arc. There's 3 specific gaps: population integrity, evidence linkage, and exception documentation. The foundational controls that any serious review, internal or external, is going to measure. Today is expose. It's not about catching failures, and it's not about shaming the institution, but rather it's about giving the people in the room the clarity to see the structural nature of the gap. So when a fix is implemented, the fix is targeting the design rather than the people. Because if you flinch, if you let the room redescribe a mechanism failure as a task failure, the remediation that you build will fix the wrong problem, and the gap will still be there the next time someone looks. Let me show you what this looks like. The flinch is an organizational reflex. It's the impulse to redescribe a mechanism failure as a task failure, because a task failure framing feels less threatening to the people in the room. A mechanism failure says that the system was designed in a way that allowed this outcome to happen regardless of any individual performance. That's an uncomfortable diagnosis because it means that the fix requires redesigning the system. A task failure says somebody didn't follow the process, and it's much more comfortable to diagnose because it means that the fix is just retraining, adding a checklist, or replacing a person. Something like an access termination policy. If a sample size shows longer than your expectation or a longer average than is in your policy, the instinct is to retrain the people on the life cycle, the process, add a checklist. But the problem is the average isn't a training problem. It's a manual coordination problem between a whole bunch of independent humans that are not likely to remember long-term or at scale. The mechanism is the problem, and the training is the beside-the-point fix for it. So here's the thing. Anybody that reviews the program later is going to find the same structural gap instantly. Auditors, regulators, or your own internal team on the next review cycle, the flinch does not hide the gap or the real problem. It just delays the moment when someone has to deal with it honestly. So here's the problem and how it plays out after the flinch. The gap is identified. The institution remediates by adding a step. Maybe it's another review, another approval, a checklist. The specific instance gets cleaned up, and the remediation report shows closed. But 6 months later, someone looks again, and the same pattern appears. But this time, it's different people, different dates, but the same structural failure, and the gap has returned. Sometimes it looks or feels slightly different, and sometimes it's maybe gotten worse because no one was watching. The hard truth is that the flinch is human. Nobody in the room might be being dishonest or intentionally dishonest, but the task failure framing genuinely feels more manageable. It feels like something that can be fixed by next Friday. Mechanism failure feels like a multi-month architecture project, and the room gravitates towards the smaller fix because the smaller fix is far less threatening to deliver. But the smaller fix does not close the structural gap. So what does honest exposure look like in practice? It looks like naming the design failure clearly in the room without softening it, and then immediately connecting it to the specific architectural fix that will close it. For instance, this is not an effort failure, but rather a design failure. The mechanism produces this outcome reliably, and it will continue to produce it regardless of how well the team is trained. The fix is not more training, but rather redesigning the mechanism so the undesired outcome is no longer possible. That statement, if delivered at the right moment in the right meeting, is worth more than the next 3 remediation plans combined. And here's where it gets urgent. Almost every company right now is looking or trying to actively deploy AI tools, or is about to. The flinch is already occurring. It's just a productivity tool. We'll figure out the governance later. Nobody's really using it for anything important. That's the flinch. That's the room redescribing an architectural question as a tool usage question. And 6 months from now, when someone asks how these AI systems were approved and what data they access, who authorized the scope, the institution will either have the mechanism and the evidence to demonstrate that they've had control of it, or it will flinch. The institutions that build the governance architecture now, before anyone asks, are the ones that will not be scrambling later. It's not a fear argument, but rather a design argument. You build the mechanism before the pressure arrives, so the pressure becomes a non-event. Honest exposure is not adversarial. It's a service to your company. You're giving them the diagnosis that leads to a fix that actually works, instead of letting them build a remediation that satisfies the immediate finding for the quarter or 2, but leaves the underlying mechanism unchanged and the problem still there, just dormant. So here's the framework that I use to test whether a gap is being honestly exposed or if the flinch is occurring. It's 5 questions. You can ask them on really any gap or any governance issue that your company is working through. Whether it's an access control problem or an AI deployment question, a vendor risk concern, it doesn't matter. The framework works the same way. Question 1. Is this about an incident or a pattern? If it's a pattern, if the same failure has appeared in more than one review, or if a similar gap surfaced before, then it's likely a mechanism problem and not a task problem. Patterns are produced by designs, not an individual. Question 2. Would replacing the person at fault fix the problem? If you could swap in a different, equally competent human being, would the outcome be the same? Because the workflow, the timing, or the system design would still produce the same result. And if so, the person was never the problem. The mechanism is. The third question. Does the remediation change the system or change the behavior? Retraining changes behavior, but redesigning the workflow changes the system. If the remediation is training, awareness, or additional oversight, then the mechanism remains untouched. Question 4. Will this remediation survive a personnel change? If the person who implemented the fix leaves, does the fix continue to work? And if not, the remediation is dependent on individual discipline, which is the definition of a mechanism gap. Question 5. Can an independent reviewer verify the fix without asking someone else to explain it to them? If the evidence of the fix is system-generated, it's an automated workflow, there's logs to prove it, a certification record that's time-stamped, whatever it might be, then the mechanism is designed and the evidence is contemporaneous. If someone has to walk a reviewer through what changed, then the fix is simply a narrative, not a mechanism. If you get through all 5 questions and the answers point to the mechanism, you have an honest exposure. But if the answers keep pointing back at people, training, or behavior, the room has likely flinched and the gap will persist. In the governance spine, the appetite, strategy, controls, evidence to reporting, the exposed stage operates at the intersection of controls and evidence. You are diagnosing where in the control layer the mechanism broke, and you are asking whether the evidence layer can prove that the control ever operated as designed. Most gaps live at this intersection. The control exists on paper. The evidence that the control operated, contemporaneous, system-generated evidence, does not. The exposed stage names that gap precisely enough that the architect stage knows exactly what to build. Diagnose tells you what's wrong, and expose tells you why it's wrong, structurally, specifically, and in language that leaves no room for a flinch. Architect, which we'll cover in the next episode, designs the mechanism that closes it. Prove generates the evidence and reporting. The 4 stages are sequential. You skip expose, and the architecture that you build in the next stage targets the wrong layer. And this applies whether the gap is in your access certification program or your AI governance program. The discipline is always the same. So here's the exercise I'll leave you with. Pick one gap from your most recent internal assessment, audit observation, or a question that keeps coming up in team meetings, whatever it is, the one that's bothered you the most. Run those 5 questions against it. Was it an incident or a pattern? Would replacing the person fix it? Does the remediation change the system or simply target the behavior? Would the fix survive a personnel change? And can an independent reviewer verify it without a walkthrough? If the answers tell you that the remediation was a task fix, if the gap is sitting in your closed column, that the mechanism that produced it is unchanged, then you found the flinch. You found the exact point where honest exposure was skipped and a softer story was substituted. It's not a failure. It's a true diagnostic result, and it's the starting point for the architecture that we're going to talk about in the next episode. So now, run the same 5 questions against your AI program. If you have AI tools deployed or being evaluated or that have shown up in your environment without anyone formally approving them, ask those same 5 questions, and the answers will tell you whether you're building a governance architecture or whether you're flinching. Thank you for listening. This is Into the Void, and I'm Mark Vanis. The next episode is Architect. We've diagnosed the gap. We've exposed the structural nature of the failure, and now we design the mechanism to close it. It's the governance architecture that produces the right outcome and generates its own evidence as a byproduct of operation. There's no manual tracking, no spreadsheet, and no hoping that somebody follows a process. It's the episode where the governance spine turns from a diagnostic framework into a true design blueprint. And if you're building an AI governance program right now, or if you know that you should be, the next episode is the one where all the pieces come together. If this episode resonated, or if you ran those same 5 questions and found something uncomfortable, share this with someone in your organization or a friend that needs to hear it. They already probably know who they are. Capability without catastrophe. That is the standard.